You feel it every month, and you keep getting told it is normal. Your paycheck buys less, your rent eats you alive, and the stock market keeps printing headlines like nothing is happening. And here is the painful truth nobody in power wants you to connect. The system does not just tolerate inequality, it actively manufactures it, then calls it policy. This is not financial advice, this is financial education. In this video, you are going to learn how money can be redirected by law in a way that looks legal, but functions like a transfer of wealth from the people who can least afford loss toward the people who benefit when the economy breaks. We are also going to tie it to what you are living through in 2026, because the mechanisms you will hear about are not some dusty history lesson. They are the same machinery running today, just with faster computers and smarter targeting. The first thing you need to understand is that in modern finance, the biggest trick is not fraud. The biggest trick is narrative. For decades, you were told the rules are neutral. You were told the market is fair. You were told inflation is temporary, and housing prices always revert. You were told if you work hard and invest long enough, you will be fine. And then the world changed. AI accelerated hiring freezes, interest rates jumped, insurance markets started collapsing in high-risk regions, and the cost of living kept moving away from wages like it found a different highway. The rules were never neutral. The rules were designed to protect certain balance sheets no matter what. Now let's talk about the kind of big bill that people barely read because it is hundreds of pages long and it sounds boring on the surface. On paper, it is just legislation. In practice, it is a pipeline. It reroutes taxation, spending, healthcare coverage, and debt capacity. And once you understand that pipeline, you stop asking why the country feels upside down. You start asking who benefits and how they pull it off. In 2008, the world learned a simple lesson. When the financial system is threatened, governments do not save everyone equally. They save the institutions that can save themselves in the next cycle. Then they let the rest of the economy absorb the shock. In 2020, the playbook repeated with different props: massive liquidity support, credit guarantees, and asset price stabilization, followed by wage stagnation and layoffs that fell on working people harder than anyone wanted to admit. The dark truth is that the system always looks for a reason to rescue the same class of people, then bill everyone else for the aftermath. Here is the 2026 version of that pattern. You watch AI replace tasks and you hear speeches about retraining. You watch the creator economy get marketed as freedom while most creators make $0 or worse, make enough to survive only until the next algorithm update. You watch the Federal Reserve say inflation is falling, but your purchasing power still feels trapped. You watch housing decouple from wages across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, so even people with decent jobs end up renting forever or moving farther away and paying in time, fuel, and stress. And you look at the wealthiest investors and somehow their portfolios recover faster than your savings ever could. Why does that disconnect exist? Because the mechanism is not random, it is engineered.
The core idea is simple. When governments reduce taxes for high earners and boost spending through debt, they do not create prosperity for everyone. They change the distribution of cash flows. They also change who takes risk and who gets protected. And when the government funds the deal by cutting benefits, slashing programs that stabilize ordinary lives, or reallocating spending to powerful industries like defense and large contractors, the losses become structural, not temporary. Let's get specific in plain language. Imagine a country that passes a massive tax and spending package. First move, reduce income or corporate taxes at the top. Second move, cut healthcare benefits or subsidies that keep the poor afloat. Third move, increase military and government contracting budgets. Fourth move, raise the debt ceiling so the government can keep borrowing without hitting a bureaucratic wall. People hear debt ceiling and think it is a technical detail. It is not. It is the system's throttle. It determines how much room the government has to spend through borrowing when it cannot or will not raise money through taxes from the people with power.
Now picture your personal life for a moment. You are not being asked to pass a law, you are being asked to live with the consequences of laws. When healthcare coverage is tightened, someone you know delays care. When wages do not rise enough to match inflation, people buy less food, postpone repairs, and take on high-interest credit. When rents rise and housing supply remains constrained, the monthly budget becomes a cage. And when the government cuts safety nets while giving tax relief to high earners, it is not an abstract policy shift. It is hunger arriving in installments. And here is where anger becomes rational. They know exactly who gets squeezed. They write the bill. They calculate the trade-offs. They can run those models faster than you can track your bank balance. They also know something else. If they time the rescue properly, they can push asset prices higher, even while working people are drowning. In 2026, you can see this in the stock market behavior. While headlines scream about real people struggling, major indices still climb, often driven by financial conditions that favor asset holders. That is not because the economy is magically fine.
It is because liquidity,
tax structures, and borrowing policies can still support capital markets. Meanwhile, your real-world budget is governed by higher rent, higher insurance premiums, and higher costs for the basics that do not care about stock tickers. Pattern interrupt. Let's talk about the interest rate you feel. The Fed's decisions move borrowing costs through the whole economy. When rates are high, mortgages become unaffordable for new buyers, and landlords are forced to pass costs to tenants. When rates are high, small businesses struggle to refinance. Credit cards and auto loans stop being just expensive and become permanent harm. And yet, if tax policy and debt policy are arranged to concentrate benefits in the financial sector, you get a market that recovers on paper while lives degrade in private. That is the first trap. Asset prices can rise without most people getting healthier. The second trap is the inflation story. You were told inflation is down. Maybe it is down compared to a peak reading. But your purchasing power is not a chart. It is your groceries, your insurance, your commute, your medical bills, your kids' school costs, and your rent.
Since 2020, many households in developed countries have lost a meaningful portion of purchasing power even as headline inflation cooled. Real life does not wait for economists to agree on labels. Your money behaves like a sinking boat while officials argue about whether the water level is falling. Now let's connect this to the bill idea, the way the money really moves. When taxes drop for high earners, they may pay less now. But the bigger consequence is where the capital goes next. High earners do not put every extra dollar into rent. They allocate it into assets, companies they already control, mergers, buybacks, and strategies that reduce tax exposure. That can support markets and create the illusion that prosperity is broad-based. Meanwhile, when healthcare benefits for the poor are cut or constrained, the poor do not just lose comfort. They lose stability. They become higher risk to lenders. They miss work or end up in emergency care instead of preventative care. That increases economic friction. It also forces more government spending later in crisis form, but with less leverage to help early. You are not imagining this cruelty.
It is a predictable pipeline. Cut support, increase fragility, then profit from the instability. And then there is the debt mechanism, the part that sounds technical but changes everything. When the government hits a debt limit, it cannot borrow as freely. Raising the debt ceiling removes that constraint, meaning the government can issue more debt and keep spending at a pace that would otherwise break the fiscal system. In the bill scenario, the government borrows additional amounts, sometimes tens of billions or more in a short time, which translates to huge funding capacity. The public might hear the government can borrow more. What they should hear is the capital markets still have a buyer. If the central bank, the Fed-like institution, does not expand its balance sheet by creating new money to buy those debts, then the government has to pull funds from somewhere else. That somewhere else is global capital, existing holders of bonds, and pension-like systems that are required to hold certain instruments. In a world where investors are already nervous, that borrowing pressure can push bond yields up and bond prices down.
That hurts anyone holding long-term bonds bought at higher prices. Pattern interrupt. Think about what a bond price drop means for real institutions. If you are a pension fund, your funding status depends on the market value of assets. If you are an insurance company, your liquidity rules care about solvency. If you are a bank, your regulatory ratios depend on asset valuation. When bond prices fall quickly, these institutions may be forced to sell to meet liquidity or risk constraints. That is how a policy decision turns into a market event. Now here is the cliffhanger. If you understand that bond markets can be stressed by debt issuance, you can understand why the timing of policy matters. Because stress creates an excuse for emergency intervention. And emergency intervention usually ends with the same outcome. Asset holders get protected, and everyone else absorbs the cost. The narrative people prefer is that governments respond to crises. The darker explanation is that crises can be engineered so that intervention becomes politically and financially irresistible. In 2026, you can connect this to how bond and currency markets behave when expectations change. When long-term yields rise, the cost of capital rises. Mortgage rates can remain high even if short-term policy rates cool off. Corporate refinancing becomes expensive. Government borrowing may remain sustainable on paper, but it pressures the whole credit system. And when the dollar is losing purchasing power due to inflation and currency dynamics, international holders of dollar-denominated assets face double pressure: currency risk plus price risk. Microstory. Imagine a middle-aged couple in Canada, both working full-time, trying to plan for retirement. They do not day trade. They buy a diversified portfolio in an exchange-traded fund that holds long-term United States bonds because it is supposed to be stable. Then one quarter comes, and the bond ETF drops. It drops again. They tell themselves it will recover.
but their bank calls because their living cost budget is up, their tax situation changed, and they need to rebalance. They sell part of the ETF at the worst time. The money they thought they were protecting gets locked into a loss. That is the human version of bond math. And now imagine that the losses in the portfolio feed into a broader system. People cancel subscriptions, stop elective medical procedures, or delay home maintenance. The economy slows where it matters most. But markets for risk assets can still look fine if capital is concentrated and liquidity is targeted. So what is really happening? The bill logic works like this. Shift tax and spending to protect capital formation and powerful industries, while cutting support that would soften ordinary hardship. Then fund the whole package through debt capacity expansion. If global bond demand changes, the resulting stress can still be managed through central bank tools because the political system wants to protect the credit engine. And here is the brutal part nobody wants to say out loud. If a country can borrow and refinance when markets wobble, then someone else gets trapped. If a foreign investor is forced to sell because of currency and liquidity pressures, the country that is borrowing effectively buys assets or keeps market functioning while the foreign holder takes losses. That is why people talk about safe assets. Safety is relative. It is often safety for the borrower, not safety for everyone else. Pattern interrupt. Let's switch from bonds to currency, because in 2026 that is the second battlefield. When a government borrows more and issues more debt, the market will react to whether inflation expectations rise, whether interest payments are sustainable, and whether the central bank will stabilize markets. If the central bank refuses to monetize in the classic way, the market may price in risk. That risk can push yields up and currency down, especially if inflation remains sticky in real terms. And currency down does not just mean you get a different number when you convert units. Currency down means imported goods cost more. It means energy prices can remain a political weapon. It means your savings in cash or conservative assets do not keep pace with your actual consumption needs. It also means that the real burden of debt payments changes for the people holding assets and the people holding liabilities. In 2008 and 2020, central banks expanded balance sheets. In 2026, you are watching a world where central bank constraints are more complex. Inflation histories are longer. Political pressure is higher. Credit markets are more interconnected. Climate disruptions are adding insurance and migration costs that hit budgets like hidden taxes. In other words, the environment is harsher, and therefore the distributional fight is harsher too. Now the next cliffhanger, the bill is not the end. The bill changes the incentive structure for the entire global system. Once global investors believe that the borrower will always find a way to protect itself, they may accept lower yields until stress becomes unbearable. Then they dump risk. Then the central bank steps in. And in the meantime, wealth is transferred through spreads, taxes, and asset price volatility. Think about the top 1%. In the last decade, wealth concentration has accelerated in many developed economies. The top segment owns more assets, owns more corporate equity, owns more real estate, and owns more shares in the financial engine. While you are losing purchasing power, they are experiencing asset revaluation. The system does not just create inequality, it turns inequality into resilience for whoever already has the biggest balance sheet. So how does the big beautiful bill-style policy translate to you? It translates through your costs and through your options. Your healthcare becomes more expensive or less accessible. Your job market becomes more precarious as AI reduces demand for mid-skill roles that used to keep the middle class safe. Your employer may replace human workers with software or automation and then tell you to be flexible. Your wages may rise slowly or not at all, while prices adjust faster than your compensation. Your housing becomes more expensive relative to income because credit conditions and supply constraints are managed in ways that favor investors and constrain first-time buyers. And your retirement timeline stretches because the system already expects you to live longer without guaranteeing you can afford it. Now bring Social Security into the story. In many countries, retirement funding is under pressure from demographics. In the United States, trust fund projections have been debated for years, and the political system keeps delaying hard decisions. In Europe and the UK, pension sustainability questions are also persistent. Underfunded pensions force future changes, higher contributions, reduced benefits, or delayed retirement ages. None of those feel like freedom when you are planning your life around retirement benefits that are drifting farther away. Microstory. Picture a 38-year-old logistics worker named David. He works nights to manage his bills. He is not stupid and he is not lazy. He just did the right thing for years. He showed up, he paid taxes, he tried to save. Then AI-based scheduling tools and automated warehousing start cutting roles. His hours shrink, His health insurance remains, but his coverage network changes, and the out-of-pocket costs jump. His landlord raises rent because property taxes and insurance costs rose. David does not have time to retrain for a job that might not exist in 2 years. He can try to invest, but every time he does, a market downturn resets his timeline. That is how systems grind people down slowly. So when you hear it is legal or it is just a bill, understand that legality is often the marketing of injustice. The mechanism does not need to be secret, it needs to be enforceable. And here is where 2026 gets even darker. The free money fantasy did not disappear. It just became more selective.
While creators post videos promising passive income, many people are making $0 from content and are financing their dream with debt. Meanwhile, institutional players increasingly dominate crypto markets. Retail investors who were promised independence are dealing with custodians, regulation frameworks, and institutional liquidity. When banks own more of the crypto ecosystem than the average person, the promise of decentralization becomes a branding exercise. Crypto promised you would not depend on banks. In 2026, you depend on the rules banks can afford to shape. Now zoom back out. Global debt exceeds enormous totals, and when debt is that large, it is fragile. It is a system where confidence matters more than fundamentals. If markets lose confidence, funding costs rise. If funding costs rise, governments can either tighten or borrow more. If they borrow more without central bank support, they can stress bond markets. If bond markets stress, central bank intervention becomes more likely. If central bank intervention occurs, asset prices stabilize, but the real economy still pays. This is why the bill's debt ceiling part matters so much. It gives the government a direct path to keep spending and keep rolling obligations. It also gives the political class time. Time is wealth in these systems. If you can buy time, you can force the adjustment onto someone else. So let's answer a question that probably popped into your head. Is this just money printing through the front door? If the government can borrow more, is that